Roger Callahan never asked for trouble. As a wildlife conservationist with 20 years of experience rehabilitating injured reptiles, all he wanted was a quiet piece of land where he could continue his work in peace. The 5-acre property in Cypress Creek Estates had seemed perfect, secluded at the end of a private road, backing up to protected wetlands with plenty of space for his specialized enclosures. The real estate agent had assured him that the Homeowners Association rules wouldn't interfere with his rescue operation as his property was zoned differently from the main subdivision. That was before Marjorie Wilkinson became president of the Cypress Creek HOA. On that fateful Tuesday morning, Roger was knee-deep in the artificial pond checking on Brutus, a 12-foot American alligator who had lost part of his tail to a poacher's trap. The late May sun beat down mercilessly as Roger carefully examined the healing wound. "Looking good, big guy," he murmured, keeping a respectful distance from the reptile's powerful jaws. "Another month, and you'll be ready for release." Brutus blinked his prehistoric eyes lazily, seeming to understand. Roger had dedicated the past 6 months to the alligator's rehabilitation, and their unusual bond was evident to anyone who observed them together. Not that many people got the chance. Roger kept visitors to a minimum to avoid stressing his patients. The sudden sharp blare of a car horn shattered the tranquility. Brutus's massive body tensed, his tail slapping the water's surface in warning. Roger cursed under his breath. He'd specifically posted "No visitors" without APPOINTMENT signs at the gate, along with warnings about the dangerous animals on the property. "Stay calm," he told Brutus, backing slowly out of the enclosure and securing the safety gate. He peeled off his waders and headed toward the front of the property, already dreading the confrontation to come. Through the trees, he could see a pearl-white Lexus SUV parked beside his mailbox. A woman in her early 60s stood beside it, her artificially blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, and an expression of grim determination etched on her face. In one manicured hand, she clutched a thick folder embossed with the Cypress Creek HOA logo. Marjorie Wilkinson, the woman who had been sending him increasingly threatening letters for the past 3 months. "Mr. Callahan," she called, her voice carrying across the property with practiced authority. "I see you're finally available. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." Roger took a deep breath, reminding himself to remain professional. "Ms. Wilkinson, I've responded to every one of your letters. As I've explained repeatedly, my property is not subject to your HOA regulations according to the county zoning board." Marjorie's painted lips thinned. "That's a matter of interpretation. I have documentation here that clearly shows." "I'm in the middle of treating an injured animal," Roger interrupted, checking his watch. "If you'd like to discuss this, please make an appointment." "This cannot wait," she snapped, marching toward him with the confidence of someone used to getting her way. "Your so-called sanctuary is bringing down property values throughout the neighborhood. The board voted unanimously last night to take immediate action." Roger stood his ground. "My property is fully licensed by the State Wildlife Commission. I'm not breaking any laws." "You have," she consulted a sheet in her folder, 17 alligators, 4 Burmese pythons, and various other dangerous reptiles. The covenant explicitly prohibits exotic animals. They're not pets, Ms. Wilkinson. They're injured wildlife being rehabilitated for release. And again, my property is exempt from your covenant." Something in Marjorie's expression shifted, a calculating gleam appearing in her eyes. "We'll see about that. The board has authorized an inspection, and I intend to document every violation personally." "You need a warrant for that," Roger warned. "This is private property." Marjorie smiled thinly. "Not according to our bylaws. Article 7, Section 3 grants the board right of access for inspection with 24 hours notice." She held up an official-looking notice, "which I delivered to your mailbox yesterday." Roger felt a chill that had nothing to do with his damp clothes. He hadn't checked his mail in 2 days, busy with a newly arrived injured python. "Now," Marjorie continued, "you can either escort me through the property now or I'll return with the sheriff tomorrow." What she didn't know was that Roger had security cameras covering every inch of his property, and what they would capture in the next 24 hours would turn Marjorie Wilkinson into the most infamous HOA president in Florida history. Roger spent the rest of the day in a state of controlled fury, methodically checking each enclosure and ensuring all gates were securely locked. After his confrontation with Marjorie, he reluctantly agreed to an official inspection the following morning at 10 a.m., buying himself time to contact his lawyer. "She doesn't have a legal leg to stand on," Attorney James Morales assured him over the phone. "I've reviewed your property documents thoroughly. The previous owner specifically had this parcel removed from HOA jurisdiction before selling it to you." Try telling her that. Roger sighed, watching the security feed on his tablet as twilight descended over the property. "She's convinced I'm running some kind of illegal exotic pet trade." "Classic power trip," James replied. "I'll email you the exemption documents tonight." Show them to her tomorrow, and if she persists, we'll file for a restraining order. After hanging up, Roger made his evening rounds, checking on his reptilian charges. In the main rehabilitation area, he paused to observe Keezer and Cleopatra, a mated pair of alligators recovering from injuries sustained in a territorial dispute with a larger male. At 8 and 9 feet respectively, they were smaller than Brutus, but no less dangerous. Unlike Brutus, who had grown somewhat accustomed to Roger's presence, this pair remained wild at heart, exactly as Roger preferred. His goal was always to minimize human imprinting. "You two stay out of trouble," he murmured, ensuring their heating elements were functioning properly for the cool night ahead. By 11 p.m., exhausted from the day's stress, Roger retreated to his modest cabin at the center of the property. He fell into a restless sleep, his dreams plagued by visions of bulldozers and eviction notices. The sharp ping of his security system jolted him awake at 3:17 a.m. Roger grabbed his tablet, heart pounding. The motion sensors at the southeast corner of his property had been triggered. Swiping through camera feeds, he froze at the sight of flashlight beams sweeping across the service road that led to his rear enclosures. Someone was trespassing. Squinting at the night vision feed, Roger's disbelief turned to outrage as he recognized the trespasser's silhouette. Marjorie Wilkinson was sneaking onto his property in the dead of night, clutching what appeared to be a camera and a measuring tape. "Unbelievable," he whispered, quickly pulling on boots and a jacket. Roger grabbed his own flashlight and hurried outside, careful to remain quiet. Rather than confronting her immediately, he decided to observe. If she was gathering evidence under false pretenses, he wanted his security cameras to capture every moment of her illegal entry. Moving silently through the familiar terrain, Roger tracked Marjorie's progress. She had clearly done her homework by passing the main entrance to access the property through a service gate used by the Wildlife Commission for inspections. The gate was supposed to be locked, but Roger noticed with alarm that the padlock had been cut. This wasn't just trespassing, it was breaking and entering. He watched from the shadows as Marjorie approached the first enclosure, where 3 juvenile alligators were recuperating from various injuries. She began taking photographs, muttering under her breath about code violations and imminent danger to the community. When she pulled out a small bolt cutter for the enclosure lock, Roger had seen enough. He stepped forward, about to call out, when a series of events unfolded that would later become legendary throughout Cypress Creek. Startled by a night heron taking flight nearby, Marjorie stumbled backward, dropping her flashlight. It rolled down the slight embankment, coming to rest against the secondary fence of Keezer and Cleopatra's enclosure. As she scrambled to retrieve it, her designer heel caught in the soft mud, sending her tumbling directly into the maintenance access door of the enclosure. The door, which Roger had been meaning to reinforce, gave way under her weight. Roger broke into a sprint. "Don't move," he shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "Stay absolutely still." But Marjorie, disoriented and panicked, did exactly the wrong thing. She screamed and thrashed, struggling to her feet just as the security lights triggered, illuminating the enclosure and the 2 very alert alligators now regarding her with predatory interest. "Oh my God," she shrieked, backing toward the broken door. "Help, they're going to kill me." Keezer the male slid into the water with barely a ripple, his eyes fixed on the intruder. Cleopatra began a low, rumbling hiss that made the hair on Roger's arms stand on end. "Look at me, not them," Roger called, his voice deliberately calm as he approached the enclosure, desperately trying to remember where he'd left the tranquilizer gun. "Walk toward me slowly. No sudden movements." Marjorie's face, illuminated by the security lights, contorted with terror and rage. "You'll be sued for everything you're worth," she spat even as she inched cautiously toward the exit. "Keeping dangerous animals like this, it's criminal." "Not as criminal as breaking and entering," Roger replied evenly, his eyes never leaving the alligators. "Now please, just focus on getting out safely." Keezer began to move, powerful tail propelling him toward the shallow end where Marjorie stood. Time seemed to slow as Roger calculated distances and options, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether this confrontation ended in tragedy or merely scandal. "Don't run," Roger commanded, his voice cutting through Marjorie's rising panic. They chased movement. Keezer, the male alligator, had now fully emerged from the water, his massive body gliding with prehistoric precision across the artificial riverbank. 8 feet of pure muscle and instinct, he moved with the confidence of an apex predator that had survived virtually unchanged for millions of years. Behind him, Cleopatra had begun to circle, effectively cutting off Marjorie's easiest escape route. Marjorie stood frozen, her designer pantsuit now splattered with mud, her previously immaculate hair hanging in damp strands around her face. For the first time since Roger had met her, the mask of HOA authority had completely slipped, revealing raw terror. "This is your fault," she hissed through clenched teeth, contradicting her own trembling voice. "You're keeping monsters in a residential area. We can discuss zoning violations after you're safe." Roger replied calmly, inching toward the equipment shed where he kept the control poles and tranquilizer gun. I need you to listen carefully. I'm going to create a distraction. When I do, you need to move, not run, directly toward the broken gate. Can you follow instructions? A strangled sound that might have been agreement escaped Marjorie's throat. Roger reached the shed and quickly retrieved a control pole, essentially a long metal rod with a noose at one end used to safely manage alligators at a distance. With his other hand, he grabbed a bucket of fish that had been thawing for the next day's feeding. When I count to 3, he instructed, walk, don't run, straight back, keep your arms at your sides. Cager responds to sudden arm movements. He took a deep breath. 1, 2, 3. Roger flung the fish toward the far side of the enclosure. The splash instantly caught both alligators' attention, their primitive brains responding to the prospect of an easy meal. As they swiveled toward the sound, Marjorie began her retreat, moving with the stiff, unnatural gait of someone trying desperately not to run. She was halfway to the broken gate when disaster struck. Her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her sprawling face first into the mud with a shriek that immediately recaptured the alligator's interest. Caesar's massive head swung back toward her, his powerful tail propelling him forward with alarming speed. Roger didn't hesitate. He vaulted the low outer fence and entered the enclosure, positioning himself between Marjorie and the approaching predator. With practiced precision, he extended the control pole, creating a barrier that Caesar recognized from previous handling sessions. Get up and go, he shouted to Marjorie, who was scrambling backward on all fours, her eyes wide with terror. Now. For once, she obeyed without argument, staggering to her feet and stumbling toward the exit. But Cleopatra had begun moving to intercept her, cutting off her escape with surprising agility for a 9-foot reptile. Get back, Cleo, Roger commanded sharply, knowing the female was more aggressive than her mate. He kept the control pole extended toward Caesar while reaching for the tranquilizer pistol at his belt with his free hand. He never had to use it on his rehabilitating animals before, and the thought pained him, but Marjorie's life was at stake, regardless of how foolishly she put herself in danger. Marjorie let out another scream as Cleopatra lunged forward, powerful jaws snapping just feet away from her. In pure panic, she abandoned all pretense of calm and broke into a desperate sprint, zigzagging toward a different section of the enclosure wall. Wrong way, Roger yelled, but she was beyond listening, driven purely by instinct. Roger made a split-second decision. He abandoned his standoff with Caesar and sprinted after Marjorie, calculating that the male would be momentarily confused by the sudden movement. He caught up to her just as she reached the perimeter wall, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind him. Stop fighting me, he growled as she flailed against his grip. I'm trying to save your life. Cleopatra was closing in rapidly, her low hiss building to a warning rumble. Roger raised the tranquilizer gun, his hand perfectly steady despite the chaos. He had one shot to get this right. The dosage was calibrated precisely for Cleopatra's weight, enough to slow her down without causing lasting harm. Just as he squeezed the trigger, Marjorie wrenched free of his grip, bumping his arm and sending the dart harmlessly into the mud. For God's sake, woman, Roger exploded, frustration overtaking his professional calm. Do you want to die here? The genuine anger in his voice seemed to finally cut through Marjorie's panic. She stopped struggling and looked at him with a strange clarity, as though truly seeing him for the first time. Tell me what to do, she whispered. The feeding station, Roger replied instantly, gesturing toward a raised platform at the far end of the enclosure. Climb up. They can't reach you there. Together, they made a coordinated dash for the platform, Roger keeping himself between Marjorie and the advancing alligators. They reached the ladder just as Caesar's powerful body slammed into the wooden supports, nearly toppling the entire structure. Up, Roger commanded, boosting Marjorie ahead of him. Her heels scrabbled against the wooden rungs as she hauled herself upward with surprising strength, fueled by survival instinct. Roger followed immediately behind, pulling himself onto the platform just as Cleopatra's jaws snapped shut where his leg had been moments before. The feeding platform shuddered under their combined weight but held firm, designed to withstand far greater stresses than two humans. For several long moments they sat in stunned silence, watching as the two alligators circled below, occasionally testing the platform supports with exploratory nudges. Roger's pulse gradually slowed as he assessed their situation. They were safe for now, both Caesar and Cleopatra would eventually lose interest when they realized their prey was inaccessible. Beside him, Marjorie's breathing remained ragged, her immaculate appearance completely destroyed by mud, sweat, and terror. Her designer suit was torn, one shoe was missing, and her carefully styled hair hung in muddy strands around her face. You saved my life, she finally said, her voice small and uncertain. Nothing like the imperious tone she typically used for HOA proclamations. Roger didn't immediately respond, focusing instead on retrieving his phone to call for backup. To his relief, he had a signal. He quickly texted his assistant Miguel, who lived on the property in a separate cabin. Emergency at Cleo/Kaiser enclosure. Bring backup control poles and trank gun. Trespasser fell in. As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he turned to face Marjorie directly. Yes, I saved your life, he said evenly. After you broke into my property illegally, cut a padlock, attempted to photograph my rehabilitation facility without permission, and nearly got yourself killed in the process. He paused, letting his words sink in. Would you like to explain why the president of the Cypress Creek HOA felt the need to commit breaking and entering at 3 in the morning? The feeding platform swayed slightly as Kaiser bumped against one of the support posts below, a reminder that their sanctuary was temporary at best. In the distance, Roger could see the bobbing beam of a flashlight as Miguel made his way across the property. Help was coming, but they still had several minutes to wait. Beside him, Marjorie hugged her knees to her chest, her usual imperious demeanor completely shattered. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the occasional hisses from below. The board voted to initiate legal proceedings tomorrow, today technically, she admitted, not meeting Roger's eyes. I needed evidence that couldn't be cleaned up before an official inspection. Evidence of what exactly? Roger asked, keeping his tone neutral despite his simmering anger. I run a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center. Every animal here is documented with the state. Marjorie's laugh held no humor. You really don't understand how these things work, do you? Do you know what happens to property values when word gets out that there's a gator sanctuary in the neighborhood? She gestured vaguely toward the enclosure. Families with children won't buy within 5 miles of this place once they know. So this isn't about safety violations or HOA regulations at all, Roger said, pieces falling into place. It's about real estate values. It's about protecting our community investments, Marjorie corrected, some of her former assertiveness returning. My husband and I have our entire retirement fund tied up in our house. We can't afford for the market to collapse because you've turned this property into Jurassic Park. Roger studied her in the dim security lighting. For the first time, he saw past the HOA president facade to the frightened homeowner beneath, someone willing to break the law to protect what she perceived as a threat to her financial security. Your retirement isn't my responsibility, he said finally, and breaking into my property isn't going to solve anything. My lawyer has already confirmed that this parcel is exempt from your HOA jurisdiction. It was specifically rezoned before I purchased it. Exemptions can be challenged, Marjorie replied, her chin lifting slightly. The county commissioners are very receptive to constituent concerns, especially from communities like Cypress Creek, where the average home sells for over $500,000. Before Roger could respond, Miguel's voice called out from beyond the enclosure. Roger, are you okay up there? We're fine, Roger called back, relief flooding through him at the sight of his assistant and 2 other staff members who had evidently been called in for the emergency. We need to tranquilize Kaiser and Cleo to get down safely. The next 20 minutes unfolded with practiced efficiency as Miguel and the team worked systematically to secure the alligators. Each reptile received a carefully measured dose of sedative, enough to make them docile but not enough to endanger their health. Roger directed the operation from above, while Marjorie watched in silence, her expression unreadable. Once both alligators were safely subdued, Roger helped Marjorie down the ladder. Her legs buckled as she reached the ground, the adrenaline that had sustained her finally draining away. Miguel quickly stepped forward to support her. Let's get you both to the cabin, he suggested, eyeing Marjorie's bedraggled state with concern. You need to get cleaned up and probably some first aid for those scratches. Roger nodded, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion. The clock on his phone showed 4:27 a.m., almost dawn, but still hours before the workday would typically begin. As they walked toward his cabin, he found himself wondering what would happen next. The documentation of Marjorie's trespassing was clear on his security cameras, but pressing charges would only escalate the conflict with the HOA. Inside the cabin, Miguel quickly set about making coffee while one of the other staff members, Lisa, retrieved the first aid kit. Marjorie sat stiffly at Roger's kitchen table, looking profoundly out of place among the functional, no-frills furnishings. Your foot is bleeding, Lisa observed, kneeling to examine Marjorie's stockinged feet. You've lost a shoe, and it's a pretty deep cut here. I'm fine, Marjorie insisted, though she winced as Lisa began cleaning the wound. Roger accepted a mug of coffee from Miguel and leaned against the counter, watching the scene unfold in his kitchen with a sense of surrealism. The HOA president, who had been making his life miserable for months, was now sitting at his table, being tended to by his staff after he'd saved her from a fate that would have made national headlines. HOA president becomes alligator food during illegal trespassing. The absurdity of it all suddenly struck him, and he couldn't suppress a short, sharp laugh. Marjorie's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. I fail to see what's funny about this situation, Mr. Callahan. Don't you? Roger countered, taking a sip of his coffee. The president of the Cypress Creek HOA breaks into my property at 3 in the morning, falls into an alligator enclosure, and has to be rescued by the very person she's been trying to drive out of the neighborhood. He shook his head. If that's not irony, I don't know what is. A flush crept up Marjorie's neck, but before she could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Roger could see the unmistakable light bars of Sheriff's Department cruisers. That was fast, Miguel commented, raising an eyebrow at Roger. Did you call them? I didn't, Roger replied, turning to Marjorie with a questioning look. She shook her head, looking suddenly pale. They must have seen the security lights. Someone probably reported unusual activity. Roger set down his coffee mug and moved toward the door. Well, Ms. Wilkinson, it seems we've reached a crossroads. Those officers are going to have questions about why you're here in this condition at this hour. He paused, watching the calculation in her eyes. I have security footage of everything that happened tonight. Everything. Understanding dawned on Marjorie's face. You're blackmailing me. I prefer to think of it as negotiating, Roger corrected. You have a choice to make in the next 30 seconds. Either we can tell those officers the truth, that you illegally entered my property and endangered both yourself and my animals, or we can tell them you're here for an early morning consultation about wildlife education programs for the Cypress Creek community. Miguel shot Roger a surprised look but remained silent. Marjorie's lips pressed into a thin line as she weighed her options. The approaching footsteps on the porch made her decision urgent. Your rehabilitation work must be properly contained, she said finally, her voice low and quick. No animals visible from the main road and educational tours only on weekends, by appointment. And the HOA drops all challenges to my zoning exemption, Roger countered. Permanently, in writing. The knock at the door was firm and official. Marjorie's eyes darted between Roger and the door, the calculation almost visible behind them. Deal, she whispered just as Roger moved to answer. Mr. Callahan, it's Deputy Ramirez and Deputy Foster. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Roger opened the door to reveal two Cypress County Sheriff's deputies, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern as they took in the unusual gathering inside the cabin. Their eyes lingered particularly on Marjorie's disheveled appearance, her mud-caked designer clothing, the missing shoe, and the first aid kit open on the table. Everything all right here? Deputy Ramirez asked, his hand resting casually near his holster. We got a call about unusual activity and lights at the wildlife facility. Dispatcher mentioned possible trespassing. Roger maintained a neutral expression. No trespassing, Deputy. Ms. Wilkinson is here for an early consultation about potential wildlife education programs for the Cypress Creek community. He gestured toward Marjorie. Unfortunately, we had a minor incident during a tour of the facilities. Marjorie nodded quickly, her public persona reasserting itself with remarkable speed despite her appearance. That's correct, officers. Mr. Callahan has been kind enough to show me his rehabilitation work, and I'm afraid I took a rather embarrassing fall near one of the enclosures. My own clumsiness entirely. Deputy Foster's eyes narrowed slightly. At 4:30 in the morning, ma'am. I have an extraordinarily busy schedule, Marjorie replied smoothly. This was the only time that worked for both of us, and Mr. Callahan was accommodating enough to agree. She smiled thinly. The HOA is considering partnering with Mr. Callahan's sanctuary for educational programming for our residents. We want to encourage a deeper appreciation for our local wildlife. Roger had to admire her composure. Not 30 minutes ago, she had been trembling in terror on a feeding platform of two agitated alligators, and now she was spinning a convincing narrative without a trace of hesitation. Is that right? Deputy Ramirez turned to Roger, clearly not entirely convinced. That's right, Roger confirmed, meeting the deputy's gaze steadily. Ms. Wilkinson and I have had our differences in the past regarding my operation here, but we're working toward a mutually beneficial arrangement. The fall was unfortunate, but nothing serious. The deputies exchanged a glance that suggested they were entirely buying the story but had no clear reason to challenge it. Your neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, called it in, Deputy Foster explained. Said she saw flashlights moving around the property at an unusual hour and got concerned. She mentioned there's been some tension between the HOA and your sanctuary. Nancy always was excessively vigilant, Marjorie commented with a dismissive wave. I assure you, everything is fine. In fact, she turned to Roger with a calculating gleam in her eye. We were just discussing the details of our community partnership. Mr. Callahan has graciously agreed to host monthly educational sessions for Cypress Creek residents, and the HOA will be featuring his conservation work in our community newsletter. Roger maintained his neutral expression with effort. That's right. We believe it will help residents better understand the importance of the work we do here. After a few more questions and a cursory look around the cabin, the deputies seemed satisfied that there was no emergency requiring their attention. As they turned to leave, Deputy Ramirez paused at the door. "Just so you know, Mr. Callan, we've had reports of someone tampering with property boundaries along the wetlands preserve. Might want to check your fencing when you get a chance." "I appreciate the heads up," Roger replied, making a mental note to review his security footage more thoroughly. If someone was messing with the boundaries between his property and the wetlands, it could create a dangerous situation for both wildlife and people. Once the patrol car had disappeared down the driveway, Roger closed the door and turned to face Marjorie. The brief facade of cooperation she had maintained for the deputy's benefit dissolved immediately. "I hope you realize what I just did for you," she said icily, wincing as Lisa finished bandaging her foot. "If word gets out about what really happened here tonight, my reputation in this community would be destroyed." "Your reputation wasn't my primary concern when I was pulling you out of an alligator enclosure," Roger pointed out. "But I'm willing to keep this between us if you hold up your end of our agreement." Marjorie's eyes narrowed. "The HOA will withdraw its complaints about your zoning exemption. But I expect you to be a good neighbor, Mr. Callahan. No alligator noises disturbing residents at night, no unpleasant odors, no visible enclosures from the main road." "Those terms are acceptable," Roger agreed, seeing Miguel's surprised expression out of the corner of his eye. "And I'll host those monthly educational sessions you promised the deputies. They're actually a good idea. Might help reduce misunderstandings about what we do here." "Fine." Marjorie stood up carefully, testing her bandaged foot. "I assume you can provide me with transportation back to my vehicle at the service gate. I'd prefer not to limp half a mile in one shoe." Miguel volunteered to drive her, and within minutes, Roger found himself alone in his cabin, the events of the past few hours playing through his mind like a bizarre dream. He opened his laptop and accessed the security footage, confirming that everything, from Marjorie's trespassing to her near-fatal encounter with the alligators, had been captured clearly. He saved multiple copies to secure cloud storage. Trust, but verify. The following week unfolded with surprising smoothness. True to her word, Marjorie formally withdrew all HOA complaints about the sanctuary at an emergency board meeting. The official statement cited new information about the educational value of the facility as the reason for the reversal. Roger received a copy of the resolution, signed by all board members, acknowledging his property's exemption from HOA regulations. In return, Roger embarked on improvements to make the sanctuary less obtrusive to nearby residents, installed additional sound barriers around the nocturnal enclosures, and planted a row of cypress trees to block the view from the main road. These were changes he planned to make eventually anyway, but Marjorie's sudden cooperation provided the motivation to prioritize them. 10 days after the incident, Roger was supervising the release of a rehabilitated juvenile alligator into a protected area of the Cypress Creek wetlands when a familiar pearl-white Lexus SUV pulled up beside his truck. Marjorie stepped out, looking once again immaculately groomed in a linen pantsuit and sensible, though still designer, flats. "Ms. Wilkinson," Roger acknowledged with a cautious nod. "What brings you to the wetlands?" "Research," she replied, holding up a glossy brochure. "I'm putting together the piece about your sanctuary for the community newsletter, as agreed. I thought some background on the natural habitat would be appropriate." Roger studied her, trying to discern her true intentions. "And you just happen to know I'd be here today?" A thin smile crossed her face. "Miguel mentioned it when he dropped off the educational program outline yesterday. Very comprehensive, by the way." The board was impressed. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the only sounds coming from the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a heron from deeper in the wetlands. Finally, Marjorie cleared her throat. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said, her voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Not many people would have risked their lives to save someone who was actively trying to harm their livelihood." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not good at this, but thank you for saving my life and for not pressing charges." Roger hadn't expected this. "You're welcome," he said simply. "Despite our differences, I wouldn't want to see anyone injured by the animals in my care." Marjorie nodded, then gestured toward the carrier that had held the juvenile alligator. "Did it just get released?" "Yes," Roger confirmed. 6 months of rehabilitation after being trapped in an illegal fishing net. He's finally ready to return to the wild. Something shifted in Marjorie's expression, not exactly softening, but a flicker of genuine interest breaking through her usual calculation. Would you show me where it goes? I've lived beside these wetlands for 12 years, but I've never actually ventured into them." 6 months later, Roger stood at the edge of his property, watching with a mixture of amusement and disbelief as a parade of Cypress Creek residents, many wearing matching community t-shirts, filed through the newly constructed visitor center. Today marked the grand opening of the official Cypress Creek Wildlife Education Center, a joint venture between his sanctuary and the homeowners association that had once been determined to shut him down. Quite a turnout, James Morales commented, joining Roger as he observed the crowd. His attorney had been skeptical about the partnership at first, convinced that Marjorie's sudden change of heart was some elaborate trap. "I have to admit, I didn't think this would work." "That makes two of us," Roger agreed, nodding to a group of excited children pressing their faces against the viewing glass of the turtle rehabilitation pool. "But here we are." What had begun as a reluctant monthly educational session had evolved into something much more significant. After their walk in the wetlands, Marjorie had returned to the HOA board with a radical proposal. Instead of fighting the wildlife sanctuary, Cypress Creek should embrace it as a community asset. Initially met with resistance, her argument had been surprisingly persuasive. A wildlife education center would not only distinguish Cypress Creek from other upscale communities, but would also position them as environmentally conscious, a selling point for the growing demographic of eco-minded professionals moving to the area. Property values wouldn't suffer. They might even increase with this unique amenity. To Roger's continued amazement, she had followed through, mobilizing the considerable resources of the HOA to support the expansion of his educational facilities. The visitor center, built on the boundary between his property and the subdivision common area, had been funded largely through a special assessment that Marjorie had somehow convinced the residents to approve. "There you are." Marjorie's voice cut through his thoughts as she approached, tablet in hand, looking every bit the efficient administrator in her tailored pantsuit. The only visible change in her appearance from 6 months ago was the sensible walking shoes she now wore instead of her previous impractical heels, a concession to practicality after her alligator encounter that she refused to acknowledge. "The newspaper photographer is here, and the county commissioner wants to do the ribbon cutting in 15 minutes. Roger suppressed a smile at her commanding tone, which hadn't softened despite their improved relationship. "I'll be right there," just taking a moment to appreciate how much has changed. Something in his tone made Marjorie pause, her perpetual motion temporarily suspended as she followed his gaze across the gathering. "It has turned out rather well, hasn't it?" she admitted, a rare note of satisfaction in her voice. "The educational programs are already booked solid through the spring." "Thanks to your marketing efforts," Roger acknowledged. While he provided the wildlife expertise, Marjorie had attacked the promotional aspects with the same intensity she'd once directed toward driving him out of the neighborhood. Her network of connections throughout the county had opened doors that would have remained firmly closed to him alone. "Did you see the community newsletter?" she asked, handing him a glossy publication with a stunning photo of Brutus, now fully rehabilitated and recently released on the cover. The headline read, "Our Wild Neighbors: Cypress Creek's Commitment to Conservation." Roger flipped through the pages, noting the extensive coverage of the sanctuary's work and the accompanying educational materials about Florida's wetland ecosystems. "This is impressive. Your work?" "Editorial oversight only," Marjorie replied with a dismissive wave, though he caught the flash of pride in her eyes. "The content came from your staff and that graduate student from the university. I merely ensured it was presented properly." Behind them, Miguel approached with an amused expression. "Roger, you need to come see this. Keezer and Cleopatra are putting on quite a show for the visitors. It's like they know they're celebrities now." Since their memorable encounter with Marjorie, the alligator pair had become the unofficial mascots of the education center. Their enclosure, now expanded and enhanced with viewing platforms that met Marjorie's exacting standards for both safety and aesthetics, was consistently the most popular attraction. Coming, Roger assured him before turning back to Marjorie. "You know, I never asked, do you ever have nightmares about that night?" The question caught her off guard, a rare occurrence. "Occasionally," she admitted after a moment's hesitation. Though less about the alligators themselves and more about, she trailed off, uncharacteristically uncertain. "More about what?" Roger prompted. "About what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she finished quietly. "Or if you'd been the sort of person who would have let me face the consequences of my actions." She straightened, her moment of vulnerability passing quickly. "Which reminds me, the last copy of that security footage has been deleted, correct? As per our agreement?" Roger nodded solemnly. "Deleted permanently." What he didn't mention was that Miguel had first edited the footage into a private blooper reel set to dramatic music, which the staff occasionally watched on particularly stressful days. Some things were better left unsaid in the interest of their working relationship. "Good," Marjorie said briskly. "Now about the ribbon cutting. I positioned the county commissioner directly in front of Brutus's released photograph. The symbolism will be excellent for publicity." As they walked toward the gathering crowd, Roger reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been fending off HOA complaints and fighting to keep his sanctuary operational. Now he was co-directing an educational center with the very woman who had once broken into his property and been chased by his alligators. The official ceremony went off without a hitch. The county commissioner, who had once been reluctant to even visit the sanctuary due to Marjorie's influential opposition, now praised it as a model of community-private partnership in environmental education. Roger gave a brief speech about the importance of wetland conservation, followed by Marjorie's more polished presentation about the community benefits of the program. As visitors dispersed throughout the center after the ceremony, Roger noticed a small commotion near Keezer and Cleopatra's enclosure. A group of children had gathered, their faces pressed against the glass as Keezer performed what appeared to be a territorial display.